installment of working on RxJS together, going through the quote-unquote advent calendar, going through and looking at learning on RxJS together and solving some of the problems that we'll have along the way. Apologies for the lighting today. I couldn't find a good enough room here for that. But anyways, let's go ahead and get started here, and hope you will follow along with me. So, let's go ahead and sorry about that. I just wanted to make sure that my announcement went out. Okay, all right, so let's go ahead and get started by talking about where we've been so far. So let's go ahead and take a look here at our advent calendar. So we've got, so far we're on the 6th day today, and each day we've gone through and done a new thing. I apparently need to update this. So the first day, like I said, is we covered creating observables by hand. Just to give you kind of an idea of how you could create them by hand if you so chose to do that. Although in the very next post, we talked more about the sequences over time as well, which talks more about schedulers. And by the third day, we actually talked more about creating observables using either conversions or creation semantics. And that was with the of, range, generate, and so forth. On the 4th day, we covered the polling operations via timer and interval. And there are a number of blog posts that are out there right now that are fairly interesting in terms of, in terms of just why you would want to do intervals and so forth, such as long polling for results and so on. And I'll find some of those and put them on the blog post as well, on the repo as well, because it kind of gives you an idea of why these particular things are important. So going back to yesterday, so yesterday was our first stream, and with that, with that particular stream, we covered kind of a lot in terms of what we were, and it was kind of overambitious on my part, especially since I didn't have the environment set up properly. But I fixed that now, so we should be able to use everything that we're normally used to, and no more TypeScript errors. So what we did yesterday is we looked at the from operation. So with the from operation, it allows us to be able to take any number of items, such as an array or array-like structure, an iterable, which is anything that exposes symbol.iterator property, and that's anything from a map or a set to a generator that exposes that. And the RxJS library that I created in addition to Rx covers most of the iterable scenarios. There's a new thing coming out called the async iterable, and that's also covered in IX. And there's some sort of back and forth between the two. So in the iterable, instead of returning next, you're returning, which returns, done, true, or false, as well as a value. This one returns a promise of true, false, and value. So that's kind of a side note, and we'll get into that a little bit later. So from observable, obviously, anything that follows the observable contract, and then we can also convert anything from a promise as well. So we did that is that we had 1, 2, 3 in a promise. Then we also had the array like, and What's interesting about that particular piece is that it doesn't have to be per se an array. It just has to have what I'll call a lengthable thing, in that it exposes a property that's a length, and it returns a number. That's pretty much all that's required of that, and this is really no different than arrayed up from the JavaScript standard library and the array extras. So, but if doing that, you'll get undefined, because there's really nothing as an indexable thing inside the array-like object, so you'll always get undefined. But if you're clever enough and you understand Rx a little bit, and we'll get there. Like I said, I'm trying to take baby steps here along the way to kind of show you how we're approaching this. So, so we'll get to what pipe means and map means if you don't know already. But the idea is that I wanted to project something with an actual value, and map is an operator that transforms the current value into something else. So it creates a new stream of new values. Nothing is modified in the existing one. It's all projected to a new observable. And then once again, we have the iterable here. So we covered that yesterday in depth in terms of you can create a set, iterate over that. You can also create a generator function, and that's marked by having function star. And function star then becomes a generator, and that has the next error incomplete semantics, just like we would normally have. And probably what I need to do is revisit some of these, especially with error handling at a certain point, to show you how you would deal with errors along the way, because what could happen in this generator function here is I could say yield 1, yield 2, throw new error, and suddenly this whole thing will blow up here because I'm not actually handling the error case. So that would be kind of tragic in that regard. And of course we can rep an existing observable, so there are other libraries that implement subscribe out there, whether it's Redux or something else that has a subscribe with the next the error and complete semantics, then you're pretty much good to go. It just accepts it as a standard subscribable, as it were. And then lastly, we've got the promise, which by far is probably the most used out of everything in terms of getting HTTP requests and everything else. There are a lot of libraries out there, of course, that expose promises as part of their APIs. Pretty much anything that goes over the network, and then anything that's stream related or anything like that is usually promise based. So converting those to observables is kind of nice in the fact that you have this nice bridge to go back and forth between promises and so forth. So we'll cover toPromise later, but I would kind of discourage that unless you really have to go back into promises land. So let's go ahead and get started here with what we're looking at today. So today we're looking at two particular pieces, the from event and from event pattern. What we're trying to do is make it as easy as humanly possible to bridge your particular library or your particular coding style to observables. So a lot of APIs produce results in some way or another. And when it does that, you want to be able to capture those and send it along to Rx in such a way that you can make the most out of it. So for example, an easy one that you would want to use is something like a button click or a mouse movement. Any of those things that come along, you'll want to capture into a stream. So mouse moves, especially if you're going to do the standard drag and drop, which is a combination of events from mouse move, mouse down, and mouse up, capturing the stream while the mouse is down and the mouse is moving. So it's kind of both. With the mouse down, kicking it off, and then stopping that particular stream when the mouse goes up. And we'll talk about how to do that via the take until operator a little bit later. And yes, from the chat, observable HTTP APIs are fantastic. So I was definitely heartened when Angular went full on observable instead of the Angular 1.x, which was more promise based. What was nice about that, especially, is because promises at the time didn't have a good cancellation semantics available to it. So it's a pretty long story in terms of there was the TC39 committee and WhatWig decided, we're going to standardize promises in one way or another. And so it was going to happen either way. And so what they really wanted to do was capture the promises A+ spec, and the promises A+ spec basically gave a very minimum contract as to a promise being a thenable object, something that you can call then on getting both the resulting value, but as well as any errors that happen from that particular computation. But what they didn't add and didn't see as a total priority at the time, which was cancellation. So when you're talking about something like an autocomplete scenario and those sorts of things, you didn't really have a way of telling that promise, no, I was only kidding, stop doing that. And it wasn't until fairly recently that we had the fetch API, and it was a fairly heated discussion that ensued about adding cancellation semantics to promises. And it went back and forth in the TC39 committee for quite some time, and a lot of those ideas unfortunately were pulled as they didn't get very far along in the process. And there were a lot of attempts everywhere to standardize a data structure, whether it was using the cancellation token from more of a .NET centric approach to something completely new. And so the WhatWig and the web community, since they kind of owned the fetch API, came up with this idea of the abort controller. And the abort controller is now implemented for the fetch API. So now, finally, in 2018, talking for 4 years later after the initial promises came out, we have a more or less standardized way of canceling promises, but it took quite a while to get there, unfortunately. Hopefully there will be more adoption in terms of cancellation operations and so forth. And I'm mildly optimistic that a lot of libraries and so forth, not only in the DOM land, but also in node land and user land, will also kind of pick that up. But observables, as we've noticed, has that completion and cancellation semantics with the unsubscribe that we've talked about earlier. So we kind of had that covered very, very early on, which made a lot of things like WebSocket communication, where you can get many values, in addition to just an XML HTTP request where you get one value, kind of reifying those into a single API gave you a lot of advantages. Of course, there are some disadvantages to a pure push based, but that's kind of another time when we want to talk about back pressure. But if you want to talk about back pressure and all that, just leave a comment in the chat below. So let's go back and get to what we're actually talking about today, which is more of the conversion from event. And so what we have is we have a number of styles of events that we kind of just want to handle out of the box, as it were, so that you don't have to do much of anything in terms of telling RxJS that you have an event emitter and you want to add and remove a listener via add listener, remove listener, and the same thing with some libraries such as jQuery, which was certainly popular when I created this library the first time around back in 2010. So that was, it kind of dates the library, certainly in terms of but jQuery is still around and still widely used. So why not continue handling those events naturally, just as you would anything else. And then of course we have our standard event targets, which is part of the DOM, and that's always had the add event listener, remove event listener, and all of the neat little goodies that they've added along the way, such as the capture true or false, the being a passive event or happening only once. Those kinds of things we want to be able to do via add event listener and remove event listener. So what exactly does from event do? Well, the first thing it does is it takes in that object, whether it's jQuery, a DOM element, or a node event emitter, and goes, okay, which event do you actually want to listen to? So in a lot of cases, it could be an event name such as data for an event emitter, error, whatever it happens to be, or for example on a DOM element, click. So or mouse move on the document itself. Any of those are perfectly acceptable. And yes, they are just kind of magic strings in the grand scheme of things in terms of which event you're listening to, but that's neither here nor there. So we can use this to do any number of those kinds of conversions. So for example here, when we're talking about click events, just say from event document click, and then you can subscribe to each of those click events. And then you can get the coordinates and do all those sorts of things. And you have, once again, those capture options, the passive, the once, and the whole bubble up stuff that you can do. So what happens here is that what we do is we create a handler in the beginning. So when you say create event, we create a handler ourselves, and that handler takes in the raw event args, whatever the arguments, whatever they happen to be. If there are more than one of them, then hey, you get an array. So for example, in Node, you can easily pass in as var args in terms of the data that you want to push. So we don't want to lose that. Obviously, we want to be able to give you all of the data that you're going to have, but realizing, of course, it's going to be an array. You have to deconstruct yourself, but that's fine, and you can certainly do that. Then what it does is it sets up a subscription, and the subscription here will take our handler that we had before, and it'll check if it's an event target, if it's jQuery, if it's Node, or if it's a DOM list, and that's one I didn't capture just yet, is that if you give me a DOM list, then we can iterate over that. So, for example, if you have a lot of buttons or document query selector all for particular nodes, then you get multiples back, and you want to apply it to all, just like jQuery. All you have to do is just say from event on click and give it a bunch of buttons, and via the query selector. So that's kind of cool, is that all of those particular things are handled. And what's nice is that, once again, because Rx is deterministic in how it tears things down, we will make sure that we don't leak event handlers. So for example, if you're doing mouse moves and mouse downs or any other events, the last thing you want to do is leave a lot of handlers sitting on your DOM objects, especially if they've been removed from the DOM itself. So preventing those kinds of leaks is kind of nice in the fact that we have this remove event listener here that will allow us to clean up nicely. So once again, for each individual type, we have the set subscription for all of these particular things and how to tear them down as well. So let's actually dig in through some code and go through and see what we can do here. So this is day 6 that we're on. So right now I'm just using Node right here. And so what I'm doing is I'm bringing in from event, and since it's the general palette that we're going to be working on, we can create an event emitter here, and say from event on data. Now, what bites a lot of people here is the fact that we're doing an emitter.emit data hello world. And guess what's not going to actually be caught when you subscribe to it? That's right. It's going to happen to have completely missed it altogether. So that's why a lot of people, a lot of the time, put in things such as share replay and those kinds of replay semantics, where you can capture everything from the first time that something is declared to versus when it's subscribed to. Can be fairly problematic if you don't subscribe to it immediately. So here, this one here will be lost, but the rest of them, won't be, in terms of we will, keep on saying what's next, what's next, what's next, and so we can go through an array and give it some values. So running this. Using npx ts node of 06 index.ts, we can run it through, and sure enough that we get foo, bar, baz, influx. Pretty darn simple. And the fact of getting that subscription here, we can also say const subscription. You'll mind my atrocious spelling in terms of the butterfly keyboard still doesn't necessarily do anything for me in terms of buttons, button stick, and all of those sorts of things. So I'm using IntelliCode. It's really nice, by the way. If you don't use it for Visual Studio Code like I do, I love it in terms of it finishes your code pretty well for you. Now let's take a little bit more advanced scenario. So for example, you could have two events that you actually care about, and you want to merge that into one. So for example, capturing an error that comes from event emitter. How would I do that? Well, we haven't really covered it yet, but let's do it anyways. So let's say const emitter2 is equal to new event emitter. Okay. And we're going to define two emitters. So we'll just say next emitter, and always using the reverse finish notation made famous by Andre Stalls. And we'll just say from event, and we'll say emitter2, and we'll say data. So data will give us our what I will call our next operation. Now, what I want to do is I want to make the error thing a little bit more interesting, in that it will actually throw an error if errors come through on the event emitter. How would we do that? Well, we can do that through just say, let's say error emitter is equal to from events and emitter2, and we'll just say error. All right, cool. So what that'll actually do is we could merge these two together, but that really wouldn't solve our problem, because we would just get an error mixed in with our next data if that actually happens to be the case. But to be kind of a proper citizen in the Rx space, it's probably nice that you do something a little bit different from that. Where what we're going to do instead is we're going to pipe the result of whatever happens to come through, and map that so that when your error comes through, we'll just actually this would be not that. This would be not that. That would, well, I could certainly throw an error that way. Is do it through map. There are a number of ways we could solve this. So if we did throw e, and if we did throw e, we could certainly do that. And it's the same thing if we had said merge map, throw error, or what have you. It's kind of the same kind of semantics. So we can then merge these two together. Now say const merged is equal to merge, and we're going to say next emitter and let's say error emitter. Okay. So now, well, it don't like me. Cannot redefine. Oh, that's because I'm an idiot. All right, there we are. All right, so here we go. So we've got our code now to merge these two together. And just to prefix it, just to be a good citizen here. So let's just comment out this right here. Don't really care. And we'll do this, and then we'll subscribe to merged. Okay. Subscribe, and we'll not only handle the next, which you can just kind of copy from up above here, but then we can also say error, whatever happens to be error. Error X. All right, cool. So now we've got both the errors and now taken care of. So what we can do then is kind of what we did up above, which is we can certainly yield a couple of values to it, and we'll just say through event emitter 2, emit some data, and then we'll just say emitter.emit emitter2, dot emit, and that will be error, and it'll be new error. Okay, and that's okay. So new error, and just say whoops. All right. So running that now, we should get. So it gets through the data and then finally goes through to the error cycle. So it says the error with our message of whoops. Cool. So that kind of showed you how we can be rich about just not only converting one event, but some events together. So next, let's talk about from event pattern. So from event pattern is more along the lines of I've got a weird API for doing events. It's not standard. by any stretch of the imagination by an existing pattern with add event listener, remove event listener, on, off, or add listener, remove listener. So hypothetically, what we can do is use the from event pattern. Because there are some APIs such as Dojo, for example, which handed you back a token for subscription, and then for unsubscription you were supposed to use that token. That was kind of some of the reason why we went down this particular path. So when we look at the documentation, we have kind of what you would expect is you have an add handler and a remove handler. So the handler itself is actually passed into you, and it's that handler that we showed earlier where it calls next on the event args, whatever they happen to be, or the arguments, whatever they happen to be, and passes that along. So here we handle that handler for you because it's a function. We've basically wrapped all those arguments in there for you. So whenever, so you can get your clicks in that way. Now you could also have, like I said, is the cases where you have a register and unregister where it takes a token, for example. And with that, how do you cancel that? Well, we actually had an overload, and I particularly added that in there, is because there are some of those APIs that take a token and do the unregister for you. So it's pretty darn simple stuff in terms of register and unregister, these kinds of things. But we're nice enough to give you kind of the flexibility there that if you want to go further on, in terms of how you define your rich events, that can certainly do it. So from the chat, we have uncaught error and a highly composed observable hasn't been, the worst experience. Yeah, sorry about that. That's always been one of the pain points is that it's fairly hard in terms of managing errors, in terms of continuing and all of that. And it's my hope, certainly over time, that we get better about that. Stack traces, everything else. We'll get there, but at least I think so in terms of tracking these down. But there are a number of these things which are user brought it upon themselves in terms of like a parse error on your map function that you gave it to anything where the HTTP endpoint's not available, therefore it threw a 500, something like that. Any number of those things could end in an error, and so that we don't necessarily distinguish between the two, whether it's a parse error versus something else. So sorry about that. But like I said, we'll certainly get there. So just to kind of show you real quickly what add event from event pattern looks like, we can just take our current event, take a new const emitter 3 and new event emitter. Okay, and then we can say const emitter $3 is equal to from event pattern. Okay, so from event pattern we pass in the two handlers. So we go h, and whatever that h happens to be, just saying whatever the handler happens to be. We'll say emitter.on, emitter3 rather dot on, add listener data to, and passing in the h for our handler. And then we have our remove, and of course we can be silly about this and actually add in some side effects to that, such as adding a console log, for example. That is So emitter, good lord, like I said, my spelling atrocious. All right, so console.log, and we'll just say added handler, and then remove said handler, and it's args any void does not match any void. What suddenly changed between the two? TypeScript. All right, so let's just take that and say removed. Meta 3, remove listener. All right, so what is it complaining for? Remove listener and add listener, because it should just give me an H, which is a function. And that's all that should have to be. Sigh. All right, well, I'll figure this out later, but this is generally the pattern of what would happen, and then you can, we can capture those as they happen along here. And we will just capture this and just run this particular thing through here and say subscription 3, emitter 3, and then go through and say init. Now let's see if Node actually complains about this, or if it, no, it does. Function provides no type signatures for arguments any void. Is there a way around that? Because seriously, that sucks. All right, well, why don't we just end it there on terms of the, unless someone's got a bright idea on this in the chat here. Otherwise, I'll open it up quickly for questions before calling it a day here. So with that, I'll be posting the code snippets that we've been working on here. And tomorrow we'll start to work on the basic composition and piping and so forth, and start diving into that, because I think well, actually no, we haven't covered all of the creation APIs like bind, but I'm not sure if we could squeeze that much time out of doing those. Either way, thank you all very much for coming here. Like I said, I'm still fairly new at this streaming thing, so hopefully my quality will improve over time. And as I said, feel free to give me feedback through here or on Twitter at Matt Podwysocky, at MattPodwysoki. I know I've got such an easy name to spell and pronounce, but give me feedback there, and I'd love to hear it, and as we continue this journey together. So thank you all, everyone, and it's been a pleasure.